the U.S. is the world's largest producer of natural gas and therefore the world's largest producer of propane by far. And we export, on any one day, we might export 60 to 70% of the U.S. supply of propane. And we export it to people that are, dependent on it. All of Africa, all of South America, all of Central America, large parts of Asia are relying on American propane to run engines, to produce power, in many cases to make plastics. So, but it really, today at least, it comes from refining natural gas, cleaning up natural gas.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CleanTechies Podcast. This is episode 67 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynor. I'm excited to bring this show to you every week, and very thankful to you for tuning in. If you are a founder in the space, in the climate tech space, please feel free to reach out if you are looking to get word out about your company. Perhaps you're seeking funding or talent, or maybe just introductions to other potential partners or past guests on the show. I'm always glad to help, so please do reach out if you're interested. We're always glad to help in any way. That's why we started the show. So without any further ado, let's get into the details of today's show. So on today's episode, we are joined by Tucker Perkins, who is the president and CEO of Propane Education and Research Council, also known as PERC. And we discussed renewable propane. So this is not something I had previously heard about or spoken about. So I think it's quite an interesting episode here. Broadly speaking, we covered the basics of the propane industry, how it's made in general, and then what are the environmental impacts of this propane, this fuel, and how renewable propane is being made as well. So generally speaking, very fascinating topic, as it appears propane could be a pretty interesting, or could at least serve as a really great interim fuel to make immediate impacts on reducing carbon emissions in the meantime, while we transition to a very fully renewables grid. So really interesting episode here. I really hope you enjoy it. As always, before we get into the show, we want to make thanks to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you are looking to make a career change, you can consider reaching out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. And without any further delay, let's get into the show. All right. Welcome to the show, Tucker. How are you doing today?
I am doing great. Thank you. Enjoy being with you and looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. Likewise. I'm very, very keen to discuss this. I think it's an interesting topic that I have not heard about prior to you guys reaching out to talk about it. So really keen for this. Why don't we just start with a quick introduction to yourself and maybe how you ended up in this role. I think you have a pretty interesting background, so be keen to hear a little bit of kind of an in-depth story of there.
Yeah, so my name's Tucker Perkins. I'm the president and chief executive officer of the Propane Education and Research Council. I'm not really here to sell anybody propane, but I really do tend to think about how what I'll call low carbon fuels like propane and certainly natural gas, we're somewhat inseparably linked, I think, how we are going to contribute to the climate conversation. So my background, I grew up, like many people in the propane business, I think, had a family that was involved in the business. Went off to college, civil engineer, came back and worked in land development, which is really interesting at the time. Didn't really think much about it, but today so much of the climate story is still around urban planning and land use planning and thinking about, walkable cities. I mean, clearly it's a part of the solution. So really a nice piece. But then I eventually moved over to be in charge of a natural gas engineering, or the engineering group for a natural gas company, where I was exposed to designing pipelines, building pipelines, managing pipelines, managing liquefied natural gas export and import facilities. It was just a great part of my career. And then eventually was promoted to run this propane division of this natural gas company. And we grew that to the fourth largest in the country. And from that, we sold that. I started one myself. I said I went from being the fourth largest to the smallest. It was me. But really taught me a lot about, the entrepreneurial push and financing things and growing and marketing, and eventually sold that business partnered back with a couple of friends of mine in the natural gas business. We created an energy manufacturing company, and then found my way to Propane Education and Research Council. I'll call that PERC the rest of the day, to really rethink innovation into this very traditional propane space.
Interesting. Sorry, I don't know if I missed it, but how did you end up getting the role to run PERC?
So as at the end of my last assignment, we were a manufacturing company, manufacturing really alternative transportation systems, and doing it really at one point in 3 continents. And I just reached kind of the end of my rope, if you would, with the board of directors and the kind of the direction. And a headhunter had called me for some time, and I said, I'm not even interested. At the end of a really frustrating week and a tough board meeting, they called me again, and I said, now tell me about that job. I'm a little bit more interested. And from that, it's been really just a wonderful last 10 years of being a part of this organization, which is crazily unique, right? We represent the propane industry to a degree. We don't lobby. We're not involved in policy at all. We're strictly involved in thinking about innovation and trying to see, I mean, I always say we approach it very differently, but to see how does propane, and then what segments should propane have a seat at the table in this energy transformation.
Interesting. Very good. Well, that's really interesting to hear kind of the evolution. It's always really fascinating to me how people end up in these roles. I think what makes most sense to go to now is if we just want to go into what is propane. I'm very, very unfamiliar with it being called a renewables type of fuel, if you will. So just could you kind of give us a summary of how propane is made? Is there a way that it's clean versus a way that it's not so clean? Could you just kind of educate us kind of very broadly on the space?
Yeah, and I think people who live generally in urban areas, Manhattan would be a classic example, or LA, you don't really think about propane because, your energy of choice, if you would either be electricity or natural gas. Anybody that lives beyond the mains generally is heavily reliant on natural gas, on propane. I can talk about that later. I've been studying the numbers, and even the numbers shock me now. But and really, what propane is, if you would, is it's one of the heavier things when we find natural gas. So when you find natural gas, you rarely have this perfect thing called natural gas. You have maybe some water, maybe some heavy liquids, and then you have this part of that barrel called propane. And so it's a lot of people will consider it a waste product or a byproduct of making natural gas. Interestingly, while natural gas in this environmental conversation has a methane problem that they really have to address, and frankly, I guess they are addressing it, propane doesn't have any methane. So propane has been widely accepted now as probably the refrigerant of the future to replace not only horrible things like chlorofluorocarbons, but it's generally regarded as one of the best refrigerants because it's so unreactive with the atmosphere. But it comes from making natural gas, which means in the U.S. at least, it's a dominant fuel, right? The U.S. is the world's largest producer of natural gas, and therefore the world's largest producer of propane by far. And we export, on any one day, we might export 60 to 70% of the U.S. supply of propane. And we export it to people that are, dependent on it. All of Africa, all of South America, all of Central America, large parts of Asia are relying on American propane to run engines, to produce power, in many cases to make plastics. So, but it really, today at least, it comes from refining natural gas, cleaning up natural gas.
Okay. So could you walk us through that process a little bit? Just like the big key items, like once the natural gas is brought in, how it's separated and what the process looks like to do it. Does any kind of processing have to go through to make it what it is in the end product?
Yeah, there is a processing, and it's interesting to see what's part of the innovation that we're working on. I talk about refinement in the fuels, but when you drill a natural gas well, and frankly, it depends on where you drill it. Natural gas looks differently in West Virginia than it may in Southern New York, and certainly differently than it looks in West Texas or Nebraska. But when you drill a natural gas well, you bring that, it's not all just gas, but you bring that to the surface, you get it into a pipe, And depending on the size of the well or the area, you take it all into eventually a fractionation facility that literally fractionates that liquid or gas into the components. So natural gas goes off, propane goes off, butane goes off, the water goes away. And that's done at a fractionation facility. And it is shocking how innovation has changed. Now, those are they're not large facilities in terms of petrochemical facilities, but they're still pretty large facilities. And they're very, very efficient at cleaning up natural gas into the different components. And that's one of the areas that we are working on a lot now, is working with those people that fractionate to make sure we're doing it as efficiently as possible, using as less energy as possible, making the gases as clean as possible, and doing it in a lot of cases with renewable natural gas, renewable propane, renewable electricity. Part of the transformation that I think the energy industry just knew they had to make.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I wanted to ask you about this, just kind of coming to mind here, is I've read at one point there was, I forget the name, I think it's Peter Thielen has a book about the independence of the U.S. and he was talking about how fracking he believes is a pretty great future in kind of using natural gas to power the economy here. I've heard a lot of people mention that they believe that fracking, there's a lot of, especially when it comes to politics, a lot of people against fracking. But my understanding is that there are ways to do it in a way that it is very clean because all the, off the methane can be captured, et cetera, where some countries may not do that. But the U.S., when we do it, does it. Could you talk a little bit about that and clear up any rumors that tend to kind of float around?
Yeah, and I think so. And we're seeing that now. And it does fascinate me that for some reason, so many people are willing to accept Russian natural gas, which is produced in many ways in an environmentally unsound manner, but yet they want to denigrate American natural gas, which at least the companies there are working hard. I would say this: if you look back since the beginning of time, the one problem with natural gas is it does have its main component is methane, and unburned methane is not it's a horrible greenhouse gas, right? And so one of the things I've done over the last 5 or 10 years, spent a lot of time doing it, is working with natural gas companies to understand what they're doing to clear up their unescaping methane. Part of it now is economic. If natural gas was $1 1,000 cubic feet, nobody, there wasn't a lot of incentive to save it, if you will, other than the environmental incentive. I need to do this because it's right. But at today's prices, the industry is very much economically motivated to save it, which to me, if you're driven by both the environment and economics, you're starting to see things like no more flaring or only flaring when it's emergency. Fix your leaks. And I would say I think the industry is still a bit unsure. I see statistics all over the place. 2.5% of the entire natural gas stream leaks into the atmosphere. 6.5%. I think we don't really know today, but we're beginning to learn as we put more and more technology out there that measures methane. But the natural gas industry acknowledges, I think, that they need to collect the methane. They acknowledge that it's good for the environment to do that, and that it's good for their own, balance sheet. So I think you're seeing a lot more effort now at capturing natural gas. Now go back. You asked a second question. I'll answer it. Fracking. I guess there are ways to frack incorrectly, but I don't see it in the U.S. And we often read about someone that talks about, well, I had oil in my water, or fracking contaminated, fracking created an earthquake. And I think that is possible, and certainly happens, but I would say responsible fracking doesn't look anything like that. Companies that and the companies, their names generally, they're intolerant of improper fracking. And then to a degree, you go to other parts of the world, fracking is not really a big thing outside of the U.S. and parts of Russia, really. Now Europe's beginning to talk about it, but I think the U.S. industry, again, really is well aware of how to do it responsibly, and that's how they know they will go forward. I don't think the U.S. we see what I would call environmentally damaging fracking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's very difficult. A lot of times I think people just pick up talking points and it can be difficult to separate kind of the reality of what's actually going on. So that's what I've heard, is that it's done very responsibly in the US and there's really nothing to be concerned about. But then we, we say, oh, we don't want to do fracking, but we'll buy it. Like you said, I was actually going to bring that up, but you already did. We'll buy it from Russia, who's perhaps not doing it very environmentally friendly. So,
I mean, I can assure you, at least in the instances I've seen, read about Russia, or really lots of the other world, they don't do it the way we do it. They don't take care for unintended releases. And I mean, in the permafrost, Russia is finding natural gas in places that we wouldn't drill.
mm-hmm.
And it's really troubling. I mean, I think part of what troubles me probably today as much as anything, we're seeing a living laboratory in Europe for how things can go when you make wrong choices, whether it's around energy independence, energy security, cost, who you ally with and who you choose to partner with. And in many cases, I find America is making a lot of those same choices, even though, I mean, I think a fifth grader could look to Europe and see the unintended consequences of some of those same decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it tends to sometimes people get out of perspective of what the kind of the benefits and the prosperity we have. We kind of tend to overlook what we came from and how we got here, and then perhaps make some silly decisions that put us in a pickle. But I think that it is important for us to remember that energy independence is a really key thing, and not just for the U.S., but also for any country, right? And just need to do it in a good way.
I think the other thing people forget, and sometimes it even shocks me, but energy, the cost of energy, the reliability of energy, it is directly functional with your growth, your way of life. I don't have to use fancy words like gross domestic product. Available energy, reliable energy, affordable energy, and your way of life are inseparably linked. And I think a lot of times people automatically think, no, that will always be there for me. And we see it. If you lived through Winter Storm Uri in Texas, you saw it when it wasn't available, right? If you were, here we are celebrating, which shocked me, the 10-year anniversary of Superstorm Sandy. You see what happens. In that case, even the natural gas, utility systems were compromised for a short while on the coast. And so you have these spot shots of losing energy, but nobody really understands that long term. There's a lot of planning that goes into it, particularly with population growth and shifts in industry. You think about now the movement towards data centers and, just the massive amounts of energy they use. Now everybody now finally realizes how Bitcoin and crypto, the creation of that is a massive energy hog. And people just don't realize, but I think now people are beginning to think about it.
Yeah, I think it's difficult when things are going well, you don't necessarily tend to consider your electric bill that much. Like I think it's just something that a lot of people overlook, but once it gets to a point and everybody's talking about it, then it becomes front and center, which I think there's obviously negative effects to people's pocketbooks, but on the other hand, it might get people to start thinking a bit more responsibly in a number of ways. What I want to do is you mentioned before the show what I believe you called renewable propane. Could you talk a little bit about that specifically and how you define that? And then I guess mainly the real kind of question I'm trying to get at here is like, if this is such a clean energy source, especially for, kind of rural areas that don't necessarily have access to the same grid in metropolitan places, why isn't it widely spoken about already?
Yeah. So let's unpack that in about 3 bites, if you don't mind. First off, renewable propane, and we finally have tried to define it. It's propane that's made from renewable sources. And by the way, today there are, we're working on, I think, 11 different pathways, but today I'll talk about a couple or 3. Today we make renewable propane from used cooking oil. And so we take, you seem to want to know sometimes the chemistry. I'm happy to go there with you. We take used cooking oil, some waste oils, but it really needs to be a waste oil. We treat it, we hydro treat it in a refinery. And in much the same way we could make renewable diesel or sustainable aviation fuel, we make renewable propane. And I'll tell you about some other feedstocks that to me are even more exciting, because it's all about the feedstock. It's all about how efficiently it converts. It's all about the energy it takes and the price of all that to get to the market. Because we stand, if nothing else, we stand for affordability and accessibility. We think those are the hallmarks of true environmental justice. You have to be able to afford it and have to be able to access it. But today we make it from waste fats and oils, some greases, by hydro-treating those, and then in exactly the same way, in fact, usually in exactly the same place, we might make renewable diesel or sustainable aviation fuel. We're making renewable propane. Interestingly, if you had asked me that a year ago, I would have just stopped right there. I would have said, we're working on some other science experiments, but we really I don't have another arrow in my quiver. Today, we're now turning dirt, building the plant, proving the process on really the next step in that, which is using, in this particular case, non-food cover crop, camelina plant. Thought I was kind of a farmer and never heard of camelina plant, but it's really a drought tolerant non-food cover crop. So germinates in about 90 days. Farmers can rotate it in with their regular crops. Helps them with erosion. It blooms and blossoms. So actually it's a bee pollinator that, they enjoy that. They combine it with their traditional equipment, and the carbon intensity of that product is going to be zero. In fact, it's probably going to be below zero. So the carbon intensity of conventional propane is about 79. Let's just call it 80 to round up for a second. The carbon intensity of propane, renewable propane made from fats, oils, and greases at the facility is 11. But now this next step, we've gone to zero. And we can do that with actually, we can do that with methane. I would say that process isn't quite ready for prime time yet. You can convert some of this methane to propane. Is kind of one of our holy grails. But today we're doing it with forest waste, with biomass, with municipal solid waste. Each of those have some pathway to make renewable propane. And it's really all, here's where I am with this. And because I kind of saw this 5 years ago in California, and now it begins to be a little bit broader than California. But even 5 years ago, we could clearly demonstrate that using propane today decarbonizes today. Propane today is cleaner than the grid today in 38 states. The grid today is fairly filthy. Still uses a lot of coal, uses a lot of oil. I mean, the clean stuff is nuclear and solar and wind and hydroelectric, but there's a lot of not clean stuff. Natural gas is coming on, but certainly coal, oil, and wood is a big part of that. So today, we still can rely on traditional propane because traditional propane, very efficient, very clean burning, even in the narrow lens of greenhouse gases. But as I saw in California 5 years ago, they said, that's not good enough. That might be good enough for now, but that's not good enough for 20 years from now. And you need to have a renewable component. Renewable component is now real. And depending on where you are and who wants to talk about it, the World Association for Propane says they'll create 50% of the supply by 2050. California said we'll have 100% of the supply by 2030. I was going to let you ask me a question, but just to keep on going, it's really been an exciting innovation because, you're talking to me about how we make propane from natural gas. And I'm really happy to see, now the natural gas industry will talk about renewable natural gas. You talk about responsible natural gas or certified natural gas. A lot of thought going into where did it come from? How did we make it? What is the true pedigree of this fuel? And now we're in that same spot with renewable propane today from fats, oils, and greases. Really tomorrow from plants and wood waste, biomass, municipal solid waste. And we're just continuing down that trail. Our scientific team, sustainability team, they're tracking 13 different pathways. And some of them don't work. We're in a super cool project right now. The kelp industry is really picking up speed because kelp is a great way to contain ocean-borne carbon. So the kelp eventually has to be harvested, and we've been working for a couple of years on trying to figure out, can we make kelp into renewable propane? It looks like you can make it into renewable fuel, but probably not renewable propane. So, a lot of times we're we'll stumble onto a process, but we'll say, no, that would be better made for natural gas, or that would be better made for renewable diesel fuel. But renewable propane. And I find a lot of people go, well, I don't understand that. What makes that renewable? And I've had this conversation, but we're taking waste products and converting them very efficiently, I might add, to a usable low carbon, zero carbon, maybe negative carbon source of energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's fascinating the many uses of this. Is one reason I think chemistry is just super fascinating, because there's so many things you can do with kind of byproducts and then turn them into something new. I guess one thing I did want to understand though is, generally speaking, from a broad perspective, do you think that propane is going to gain a lot of traction in use as it's continuing to get even cleaner than it already was, kind of as perhaps an interim fuel in the meantime?
Yeah, I do. And I really think that probably was against conventional wisdom, because the conventional wisdom is that fossil fuels need to become extinct and renewable fuels need to be prioritized. And I think we're beginning to see something that I believe we thought 5 years ago. No, we're stepping over the ability to decarbonize now. Why do we continue to use so much diesel fuel, so much gasoline, when there are cleaner alternatives today, propane, natural gas being the two? And any chance today to use propane in lieu of diesel fuel, propane in lieu of gasoline, that's a step forward for the economy. By the way, it's also massively cheaper right now.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, you need to have a path to a carbon zero fuel. That's where
Mm-hmm.
renewable propane comes in. And we see it very strongly in three markets. Transportation, for sure. And by the way, not all forms of transportation. What you and I drive as consumers, in our daily life, to and from the store, to and from work, you're welcome to drive an electric vehicle. I guess you're welcome to drive a Hummer if you only drive, 1,000 miles a year, right? It's really almost inconsequential in the world of emissions. We're working for commercial vehicles that maybe drive 7 days a week, maybe 24 hours a day, maybe 500 miles a day, maybe have payloads of 60,000 pounds, right? That's where they get 3 or 4 miles per gallon. And that's where we really need to work on the emissions. And that's where we have been. So transportation, power generation in general, and not utility scale power generation, even though we're doing some of that now using propane, but microgrids, peak load management, maybe base load management, let the utility have the peak, but a lot more power gen. And then the last piece for us is material handling, and not just in distribution warehouses, but in places like ports and lumber yards, and exciting projects just starting this week right near you in the port of Newark, where same thing we've been doing in the port of Long Beach. But they're massive consumers of diesel, and they're massive, in terms of not only physical operations, but they're surrounded by urban centers. It's the place we should prioritize clean air, right?
Yeah.
And diesel shouldn't be a choice. Hydrogen's not really ready today. Electricity, the grid's just not robust enough to take on that fresh demand. Propane's coming in and filling that gap. I love that you called it an interim fuel. I think, the traditional words for that is a bridge fuel. And while I am comfortable it is a bridge fuel, I'm not comfortable to predict how far out that bridge might be. I feel comfortable, and I say it often. Today, we sell about 10 billion gallons of propane in the U.S. domestically for consumers. And when I say consumers, I don't mean just you and me as an individual, but also businesses. So B2B or B2C work, we sell about 10 billion gallons. And I'm comfortable that we'll sell 15 billion gallons in the next 4 to 5 years, as we see more and more power generation, more and more material handling, and more transportation, because we should. We should replace diesel. I mean, I say all the time, let's make this diesel's last decade. Diesel is inherently dirty. It's inherently dirty to store. It's inherently dirty to use. It's complicated and expensive. And I love talking about, one area we go head to head now with diesel and electric is in student transportation. School buses. Big old yellow cheese. Everybody rides to school every day. Today we have 22,000, give or take, propane school buses. in every state. And we're seeing it was truly driven by environmental, right? It was driven because particulate matter was so harmful to children. NOx emissions are so harmful to children's lungs. It was driven by environmental benefit, but this also was a massive economic benefit. And now we see that. So now enter electricity and an electric school bus. And I'm quick to say, I don't really need to choose a fight because there are two ways to do it. Transport children in electric buses, transport children in propane buses. Either way is perfectly fine. The propane option is a fourth the cost of the electric option. And so the real winner for me is that we can get rid of old diesel buses at 4 times the rate by choosing propane. And that's the win. So it is a classic example. And by the way, we run some school fleets now on renewable propane. Generally, California, they wanted to take the lead in, one, they wanted to be a good test fleet for us about just seeing what we learned from it. But also they really want to take the lead in environmental stewardship. And so that is the next path as we move from conventional propane to renewable propane blends, I think, and then eventually to 100% renewable propane.
One thing I'm curious about is, making the shift. Are there any areas where the fuel is just kind of swappable without major upgrades to the equipment, or does this have to be kind of a swapping out of the equipment entirely? I'm not sure how the compatibility of diesel versus propane and whatnot.
Love your questions. So if you're talking about going from diesel to propane, those engines, while technically they're a way to modify them to do it, historically we don't like that because it's just a modified engine. And really what we're looking for is something that is a high performing, low emission, powerful. And so we tend to recommend replace your diesel bus with a propane bus. Now, if you're talking about the migration from conventional propane to renewable propane or anything in between, that is a perfect drop-in fuel. And so that's what we love to advocate for. UPS, FedEx, Nestle Water, the other 100 fleets that come to mind immediately, start today with conventional propane because you're cleaner than an electric vehicle in 38 states. 5 years from now, if we reached a real strong inflection point where the grid is truly clean, then we'll accelerate using renewable propane. But your goal should be to always be as clean as or cleaner than an electric vehicle. And I think that's a fairly easy goal to achieve.
That's helpful. I think I think it's also interesting. A lot of people make the argument that, at least they made the argument when I was growing up around, especially when Priuses were a very big thing, complaining about the fact that these were manufactured across the ocean and then shipped, and all that kind of emissions that came from the whole process sometimes didn't necessarily net out and to a positive impact. So it is interesting to think you maybe the fuel isn't exactly 100% clean, but because of the supply chains and everything, when you account to all for it, might actually have a better impact in the long run. So I think it's interesting to consider these different options while the supply chains are being cleaned up, if you will. One thing I wanted to, I don't know if we talked about this at the beginning, but you had some stats on propane usage for people. Like what percentage of people tend to use propane right now, especially you mentioned, I think, rural areas and consumers in that region?
Yeah, I think the reason I've got the statistics is so often when I travel and I'm talking with energy experts, people that labor over justice or equity or the grid or natural gas or climate, and I'll ask them usually, well, how do you see propane fitting in? And often they look at me blankly. Why would the fuel that powers my grill be a solution for the climate and be a solution for America? So it really caused me to do a lot of thinking because, as a person, I said I ran the 4th largest propane company in the country at one time, and I'm pretty familiar with the numbers. But interestingly, propane itself was about 2.5% of the energy mix of America. 2.5%. Oddly, these numbers kind of mirror the world as well. About 2.5% of the energy mix of the world. In America, I can just rip it off. This morning, 1.25 million children rode to school on a propane school bus. 800,000 farms rely on propane, to dry grain, keep their animals warm. There are nearly 500,000 forklifts running around in material handling and distribution centers. 5 million people use it as the primary heat in their homes. Another 3 million homes use it for something else, and another 2 million homes use it something not for heating, but perhaps something as simple as fire logs. 50 million homes have a grill. You kind of do all that math. 600,000 commercial businesses look for us. Nearly 800,000 people, 800,000 homes have a backup generator. You kind of do all that math, and about 75% of the population of America is coming into contact with propane on a day-to-day basis. So it's exactly what we think. It's a fuel that people think of beyond the natural gas main, but as this energy transformation happens, we're back into material handling all through. I mean, I'm shocked as I go to LA and I look at the number of material handling centers inside the city relying on propane. Power generation all through the California market, because we have microgrids and backup power and some prime power. So we really are a fuel. We're thought of as a fuel of rural America, but as we really begin to rethink how America shifts to a cleaner climate, a renewable energy, a lower carbon climate, but one that we can afford and access, propane has so many of the solutions. And by the way, we have this gross abundance. I say we use about 10 billion gallons a year. We make almost 30 billion gallons a year. And so that difference is exported away. It's exported to Central America for a lot of power generation. It's exported to Asia for a lot of consumer heat and electricity production. A lot of propane goes into Africa, changing people's lives every day to kind of move them from cooking on wood or charcoal or dung to cooking with propane. And it's amazing. It's an amazing transformation. And I've had a chance to kind of travel through some developed nations and then some developing nations. And the contrasts are stark, but the results are always the same, using it in a way that's best suited for it in that environment.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing, I don't know if you touched on this already, was that I wanted to ask is if we do really start to utilize propane more in many other areas, will there be any scarcity issues with creating it?
No, I do not believe so. In fact, by the way, we talk about that some internationally because ships are moving away from bunker fuel, right? And quite a few ships have been choosing propane. And, 10 years ago, when we were talking about whether to even get behind that technology, a really intelligent leader of our industry said, I worry about that could consume all of our propane. But I think the truth is there isn't a universal perfect fuel, right? And so some ships will choose propane, some will choose ammonia, some will choose LNG. They all should move away from bunker fuel, and they need to. But again, domestically, we have 10 billion gallons of demand with 30 billion gallons of supply. We export on any one day 70% of our production. So we have so much room. Now beginning to create renewable propane, and knowing comfortably that we can produce 1 billion gallons of renewable propane today. We could produce 2 or 3, we think, probably. So all of a sudden we continue to expand the sources of supply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say, if you can make it from all those different feedstocks, then it's also increasing the places that you can find it, right, to create it. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
it's pretty compelling in a lot of ways. I guess,
and it's interesting, just as we talk about feedstocks, one of the things we thought about 5 years ago and even more prevalent today, because everybody talks about lithium. Well, there's not enough lithium to go around for batteries that people have uses for those batteries. Just like I'll talk about municipal solid waste. It could be that municipal solid waste is the playground for most of the renewable natural gas. And so we really not only think about what are the potential feedstocks, but what are the likely feedstocks that we have access to that others wouldn't want, and can we convert them affordably and efficiently? And so it really is an interesting game at that point to think about where should we prioritize for feedstocks and processes, so we won't be thinking about scarcity in a decade or two. And I think it all changes. It all changes when we begin to resolve where we go with nuclear power, where we go with batteries. I'm convinced the battery of the future will not be a lithium ion battery. I'm convinced it might not even be in the back rooms of a laboratory today. I mean, right, the battery of 2050 or 60 will look completely different than what's on our table today.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've had deep conversations with people that believe nuclear fusion will be here, you know, in the next decade. And boy, that would be a game changer too, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it is very fascinating. I think somebody I had on here at one point mentioned that, and it would be pretty awesome. One thing I did want to ask if you can share is, are there any specific companies that you know that are doing a lot of innovation in this space, to either clean up propane and make it renewable, or companies making kind of machinery that use propane? Just any companies that people should keep an eye on for really kind of fascinating and innovators in the space.
Well, I mean, I'll start with a couple of big companies. I mean, we're in a fascinating project with Cummins. I've been involved with it for almost 8 years, but we are now, it's all public that we're going to market with a propane engine, purpose-built propane engine. That Cummins, when we set about creating it, and we set some metrics that for CO2 capture and things, and I thought to myself, if we could get close to that, I would be so happy. Cummins hit every target and exceeded most of them. So Cummins is an example of an engine company that sees a great future. I think about a name people. I used to be a household name. I wonder sometimes, but Renai. Do you know the name Renai? They make a lot of water. They work primarily with builders, but they have, they're a Japanese company, had a U.S. division here for a long time. Now almost all the manufacturing in North America is done in and around Georgia. They have some of the most innovative water heating, power generation, heat pump style devices that, the world has seen. I love to mention them as a place to look for innovation. I think Chevron, I don't want to leave out Chevron. They really are kind of leading the charge right now on renewable energies, but this camelina weed, World Clean Energy Group, cutting edge, if you will, of making renewable fuels. And I'm shocked about how smart they are. If I move to the electric space, I could give you names for an hour. But one name I love to throw out there is 2G Energy. Really beginning to lead the charge as we think about how we efficiently use propane to make electric power. And love to mention that name.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. I appreciate that. I think perhaps I'll have to chase some of those to have them on the show. Yeah. I guess maybe just any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with, kind of on your thoughts on the future of propane, maybe some of the next challenges that you think need to be solved in order to really roll this out. Just anything that you want to leave us with.
Well, I think the thing that I always love to leave people with, one, is that the current narrative I find to be totally misleading. The current narrative is that the only path to a clean climate is through electrification. I think we see day in, day out, how the widest path possible is the most resilient path. The one, again, if you lived through Winter Storm Uri or Superstorm Sandy, you just came through Hurricane Ian. I was just there seeing not only the destruction, but seeing how quickly cell towers and shrimp farms and things came back because they relied on propane that didn't let them down. So I think the current narrative that the only path to a clean climate is through electrification is woefully wrong, probably in the long term, certainly in the short term. That low carbon fuels like propane, like natural gas, particularly with a path towards renewable pedigrees, they clearly have a seat at the table. And I think once we can get past this narrative and really get it back to a factual basis, then we can go to work on some of this innovation that we're seeing, innovation at Cummins, innovation at Renai, innovation with 2G Energy. And because that's really what's exciting. And the innovation is limitless. People, everywhere I go, I say, I'm shocked at how dirty the grid is. We study the carbon makeup of the grid and it's filthy. And everybody says, yeah, sure it is, but it soon will be cleaner. And I'm like, I hope so. I'm not sure. I'm not sure so. I used to think I was sure so, but until we resolve our way clear with renewable or renewable power, nuclear power, hydroelectric, those are the clean choices. But the pace of innovation in propane, renewable propane, and the technologies, it's equal to that pace of innovation as we move from traditional electricity to a cleaner grid. And I think if people really knew what was going on there, it would be so exciting for them because it's affordable, it's accessible, and it's environmentally sound. It's good for your health. It's good for your financial health. It's all of that is the right direction and good for America. It's a great story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. Like I said, this is a topic that was completely foreign to me, so I really enjoyed having you on. Where should people reach out to learn more about this industry and what you guys are doing?
Well, we spend a lot of time working on our website, propane.com. And again, we're not there to sell you, but there is a great tab there about the beneficial story for the environment. And so we always love people if they go to propane.com and really begin to see what's there. If they work their way through that website, they can always find me, and I'm happy to reach out and talk with people about some of this. And our tentacles run deep. We're working in almost all of the 50 states with some of the leading technology groups, some of the leading universities, Department of Energy, and the federal national labs across the country, just to see that our solutions literally are solutions of the future and really help be part of this energy transformation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Definitely encourage people to reach out and learn more. And I think keep an eye on this space. It's gonna be great.
Great. Thanks for your time. Thank you so much. Great question.
Yeah. Thank you, Tucker. Have a good one.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. Please let us know what you thought about the show. You can reach me over LinkedIn, Twitter, Slack, email, whatever you prefer. And always keen to continue the conversation. If you have comments or perhaps requests for future guests or topics, we'd be really keen to hear from you. Please do feel free to reach out. And of course, we do encourage you to share this episode with somebody who might find it interesting. I think given that this was a very new topic, there's a very good possibility that many people in our circles could be interested to learn about this. Of course, do consider reaching out to Tucker directly on LinkedIn and learn more about what they're doing at PERC. And if you are joining us for the first time and you enjoyed this episode, please, we ask that you subscribe and turn on notifications, as well as, if you enjoyed it, leave a review for us on Apple Podcasts. It's extremely helpful to get our listenership up, so really do appreciate that massively. Quick note on our next episode. We will be joined by Kaylin Brown and Kristen Castell to discuss what ShareChange is doing in the microfinance space. This conversation spans broadly across what ShareChange is doing with microlending to entrepreneurs in unbanked regions, but also more broadly about the importance of microfinance in general. Generally speaking, really a great conversation about impact investing and how important it is. There's so many amazing kernels of wisdom that the both of them shared. So really excited to bring that to you next. And as always, thank you for tuning in to the CleanTechies Podcast, and we will see you next time on the show.